A millionaire decided to make a romantic surprise for his fiancée, imagining that he would find at home one more reason to believe in the perfect marriage he was about to experience. Upon arriving without warning, however, he encountered a silent and disturbing scene, capable of shaking not only his confidence, but everything he thought he knew about the woman he loved. What seemed to be just a domestic detail quickly transformed into a cruel discovery, revealing a dark side hidden behind elegance, charm, and impeccable appearances. And the more he observed, the more he understood that that unexpected surprise would not only change an ordinary afternoon, but would decide the entire destiny of his life. Before hearing this story full of shock, disappointment, and revelations, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next impactful reports. Raphael Drummond had the habit of measuring the day by the weight of the contracts he signed. On that Thursday afternoon, however, something different took him out of the office earlier than usual. It wasn't a meeting, nor a business commitment, but a simple and rare impulse. The kind of thing a man like him had learned to suffocate in recent years, too busy with spreadsheets, goals, and the management of 4 hotels spread across São Paulo. It was the desire to do something beautiful without a specific reason, to appear before Isabella with flowers and an unarmed smile, as if the two were still at the beginning of everything, when every gesture counted more than any professional achievement. He stopped at a discreet flower shop on Rua Leopoldo Couto de Magalhães, in the heart of Itaim Bibi, and chose the bouquet himself. Nothing exaggerated. White roses with eucalyptus, simple and elegant, the way she always said she preferred. The young woman who assisted him commented that it was a beautiful choice for a surprise, and Raphael smiled without responding, because what he felt at that moment was difficult to put into words. It was a mixture of anticipated joy and something like gratitude, a lightness that he rarely managed to achieve during office hours, and that afternoon, had arrived without being called. 42 days were left until the wedding. The invitations had already been sent to most of the guests, the hall in Jardins was reserved, the menu approved, the honeymoon confirmed in Lisboa. Everything was in place. Everything seemed fitted with a precision that at times scared him a little. Raphael knew he was capable of building companies, of negotiating contracts in hostile environments, of transforming deficit-making hotels into profitable businesses. But the idea of a marriage, of a life for two planned with all this exactness, still caused him a kind of good vertigo, like someone looking from the top of a very long staircase and deciding it is worth going down. Raphael had grown up in a backyard room in Tatuapé, son of Maria Luisa, a woman who had worked her whole life as a washerwoman and who had raised her son alone after her husband left when Raphael was still crawling. He knew up close the value of everything conquered. The Drummond hotel chain had not been built with an inheritance, nor with an influential godfather. It had been built with 15 years of work, 2 technical bankruptcies overcome, sleepless nights, and a stubbornness that those close to him sometimes admired, sometimes lamented. There were moments when he still woke up with that old anxiety, that of someone who grew up without a safety net and could never completely forget what that means. Success had not erased this memory. It had only wrapped it in more comfort. When he met Isabella Vasconcelos on a vernissage afternoon at the Museo de Arte Moderna 3 years ago, he was at the peak of a trajectory that seemed increasingly solid, but that still seemed to him at certain moments to belong to another person. Isabella was everything he was not by origin. Daughter of a traditional São Paulo family, raised between expensive schools and seasons in Europe, she had that lightness of someone who never needed to fight to occupy a space. She was beautiful in a way that didn't immediately draw attention, but that remained. She had firm opinions about art, about architecture, about the city, and knew how to listen to him with an attention he rarely found in other people. In the first months, Raphael had been impressed with the combination of elegance and affection that she seemed to carry so naturally. The Vasconcelos family had received him well, better than he expected, and this had also weighed on the decision. He felt accepted in a world that, for a long time, he had faced with suspicion. Isabella's father, a 70-year-old lawyer, with the slow accent of someone who chooses every word, had been the first to extend his hand with something that seemed genuine. This remained stored away. Raphael was not a man to hold grudges, but neither did he forget good things easily. While walking on foot from the parking lot to the building where they lived, Raphael swiped his card in the hall with the bouquet in hand and took the elevator in silence. He didn't send a message warning that he would arrive early. He really wanted the surprise. He imagined Isabella's expression when the door opened, the way she would slightly tilt her head and smile with one corner of her mouth before any word. He knew that smile. He had spent months trying to provoke it in different ways, and even today, after 3 years, he felt that small and particular satisfaction every time he succeeded. The apartment door opened without noise, as always. Raphael entered and stayed quiet for a moment to perceive where she was. The living room was empty, the television off. There was a soft perfume in the air, the bamboo diffuser that Isabella had placed in the hallway weeks ago. He headed toward the kitchen, and it was then that he heard voices coming from the service area, separated by a half-open door. He stopped before arriving. Not by intention, but by instinct. Something in the tone of what he heard braked him before he himself understood why. It was Isabella's voice, controlled, almost low, with that impeccable diction she always maintained. And there was another voice, much more discreet, almost a murmur, which Raphael immediately recognized as being from Donna Conceição, the lady in her 50s who worked in the apartment 3 times a week for almost 2 years. There were no screams. There were no swear words or direct insults. There was something harder to name, a tone that Raphael needed a few seconds to decode, because he was used to hearing that voice with softness. What reached him now, from the other side of the door, was cold. It was the coldness of someone who does not mind diminishing another person because they believe, with absolute tranquility, that they have this right. Isabella was saying that the sink in the service bathroom had not been cleaned properly, that the mirror still had marks, that it was not possible for a person to do the same wrong thing every week. Each sentence was accompanied by a careful pause, as if it were being constructed to leave the other without an answer. Donna Conceição responded with a yes, with an I'm sorry, with an I will redo it, her voice so low it barely crossed the door. Raphael stood motionless in the hallway, the bouquet hanging in his hand, unable to take a step either forward or backward. He stood there for almost 2 minutes, which seemed much longer to him. When the voices finally ceased, he backed away slowly, left the apartment without making a noise, and went back down to the building hall, the bouquet still intact in his hand. He sat on a stone bench in the external garden for almost an hour, looking at the movement of the street without really seeing anything, before sending a message saying that a meeting had extended and that he would arrive for dinner. He left the flowers on the bench when he left. He had no way to explain why, but something inside him knew that that afternoon had changed something whose dimension he was not yet capable of measuring. While walking back to the parking lot with empty hands, Raphael tried to understand what he had felt upon hearing that scene. It wasn't exactly shock. It was something more like the discomfort of recognizing that he had been close to something for a long time without really seeing it, like when you live next to a constant noise and only perceive its presence when it stops. That controlled voice, that calculated pause, that tone that didn't need to scream to diminish, all of that had been there for 2 years, happening in the spaces where he was not, in the shifts when he arrived too late to witness. And now, suddenly, it was with him, inside his chest, asking him to decide what to do with what he had just discovered. The next day, Raphael arrived at the office earlier than normal, but worked less than ever. He spent a good part of the morning looking at reports without truly reading them, responding to emails halfway, and letting calls fall into the silence of the voicemail. The scene from the previous afternoon did not leave his head, not because it was extraordinarily violent or scandalous, but precisely because it wasn't. It was banal. It was domestic. It was the kind of thing that happened in apartments all over the city, without anyone around noticing, without any alarm sounding, without anything being different the next day. He tried during the morning to construct reasonable explanations for what he had heard. Isabella was stressed with the wedding preparations. The last few months had been intense for both of them, each in their own way. Perhaps that specific day had been difficult in a way he didn't know. Perhaps Donna Conceição had really gotten something wrong, and the situation had taken a drier tone than usual. Raphael was a man of solving problems with data, and the data he had was insufficient for a definitive conclusion. This he recognized. But there was another part of him, quieter and older, that insisted on not accepting this logic as sufficient. Around noon, he sent a message to Isabella asking how her day was. She responded quickly with her usual lightness, telling him that she had gone to the seamstress's atelier for an adjustment on the dress and that the result had been beautiful. She sent a photo of the embroidery detail, asked for an opinion. Raphael responded that it was perfect. He kept looking at the exchange of messages for a while, trying to find in those words some indication of what he had heard the previous afternoon. There was nothing. It was the usual Isabella, relaxed, affectionate, present. This should have relieved him, but it didn't relieve him completely. In the afternoon, he made a decision that he himself recognized as unusual for his profile. He told his secretary he had an external commitment, left the office at 4:30 and returned to the apartment without warning, exactly as he had done the day before. This time, however, the decision was conscious. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was an observation. Raphael rarely admitted to himself when he was worried about something he couldn't control, but that afternoon had been an exception. The door opened with the same silence as always. Isabella was in the living room, her laptop open on the coffee table, a glass of water with lemon beside it. She looked up and smiled with that expression of genuine surprise that he had imagined the day before, and for an instant everything seemed exactly as it should be. She stood up, they gave each other a quick hug. She asked if everything was okay. He said yes, that he had left early due to a cancelled commitment. Isabella went back to the laptop, and he went to the kitchen to get water. That was when he heard Donna Conceção in the side hallway, lightly dragging the bucket with wheels toward the guest room. The presence of the worker would not have caught his attention on another day. But at that moment, Raphael paid attention in a different way, with a kind of attention he had never directed before to that part of the apartment. Isabella looked up from the laptop, and without him expecting it, said from the living room with a voice that carried that same controlled tone, that Conceção should not forget to wipe the bedroom mirror with a dry cloth after cleaning, because last time it had been left with streaks. The sentence was objective, but the way it was said, without looking at the worker, without any softness, like someone talking to the air, hit Raphael in a way he couldn't ignore. Donna Conceção responded, yes, with her back turned, without stopping what she was doing. Raphael stood still by the kitchen counter for a few seconds. Then he took the water, went back to the living room, and sat near Isabella. She told him about the dress adjustment, about a friend who had called to confirm attendance at the ceremony, about a detail of the menu that the wedding planner had suggested revising. He listened, responded, participated in the conversation, but a part of his attention was elsewhere, monitoring something that he still didn't know how to name properly, but that had installed itself with a firmness that the discomfort of the day before hadn't had. That night, after Isabella fell asleep, Raphael stayed awake for a long time looking at the ceiling. He thought of Maria Luisa, his mother, who had spent decades working in other people's houses without ever being treated with cruelty, but also without ever being treated as an equal. He thought of how many times she arrived home with fatigue installed in her body in a way that was not just physical. He thought that he had grown up promising himself that he would never be the kind of person who treats workers like part of the house's furniture. And then he thought, with a discomfort that took time to turn into clear thought, that he had slept for 2 years beside someone who did exactly that, and that he had needed to arrive early by chance to realize it. He didn't jump to conclusions, not yet. But he decided he would continue observing. In the following days, Raphael began to notice things that previously passed invisibly: the impatience with the courier who delayed a delivery, the tone with the building's doorman when he took a few seconds to open the gate, the way she returned a dish in a restaurant in Jardines, without looking at the waiter who removed it. Each of these scenes separated could be explained. Together they began to compose a pattern. And Raphael had spent the last 15 years of his life learning to recognize patterns. There were also the comments that he had previously interpreted as humor or perfectionism, and that he now heard in another way. When Isabella said with a light smile that certain people simply couldn't understand clear instructions, who was she talking about? When she used the word ingratitude to describe an employee who had asked for a raise after 2 years without an increase, There was something there that went beyond an opinion on domestic finances. There was a very clear hierarchy in her head, a distinction between people who mattered and people who were useful. And Raphael had spent 3 years sitting on the inside of that division without seeing it. On Friday of that week, while reviewing contracts in the office, he received a message from the wedding planner with a link to approve the order of the songs for the ceremony. It was a careful list, with those songs that the two had chosen together on a Sunday afternoon, each with a story, each with a meaning agreed upon between them. Raphael looked at the list for a long time. Then he closed his phone and went back to the contracts. But the list stayed with him during the rest of the day, like a mirror turned to an angle he was not yet ready to face completely. At the end of that afternoon, Raphael left the office and went for a walk along Avenida Faria Lima without a clear destination. He stopped at a cafe, ordered an espresso he barely drank, looked at the movement of executives and delivery people sharing the sidewalk with the indifference of those who live parallel worlds in the same space. He thought that there was something very specific in that which bothered him. It wasn't that Isabella was a bad person. It was that she seemed completely unaware that she was being cruel, and that, he realized, was much harder to face than an overt malice. There was also a detail that stayed with him for days, the way Donna Conceção had said yes at that moment. It wasn't the yes of someone who agrees. It was the yes of someone who closes a cycle so they can start the next one without spending energy on useless resistance. Raphael knew that kind of response. He had given versions of it when he was young, in environments where questioning cost more than it was worth. The difference was that then he had had choices that eventually took him out of that place. And he wondered, that afternoon at the Faria Lima Cafe with the espresso still untouched in front of him, how many people around him didn't have those same exits available and simply continued saying yes with that particular texture day after day, without anyone around noticing what that yes really carried. The second week was the one that transformed doubt into certainty. Raphael returned to the apartment without warning for the 3rd time on a Tuesday afternoon, and what he found was not a repetition of what he had seen before. It was something worse. It was the confirmation that that had nothing to do with stress or difficult days. It was a habit. It was part of the structure of the person he was about to marry. This time Isabella had called Donna Conceção to the living room. The worker stood near the door, hands crossed in front of her apron, while Isabella, sitting on the sofa, with the exact posture of someone who occupies the center of the space by right, spoke about the way the bedroom pillows had been arranged. It wasn't a technical criticism, it was a demonstration of power. The way she paused between one sentence and another, the way she waited for Donna Conceção to agree before continuing, the way she used expressions like, "I already explained this before," and "it's not that hard," all of that composed a ritual that didn't need violence to be humiliating. Raphael stood still in the hallway for the same amount of time as usual, invisible to both of them. Donna Conceção responded with monosyllables, her head slightly tilted, without counteracting any of the statements. And there was something in that posture that broke something in Raphael differently than the other times. It wasn't passive resignation. It was the behavior of someone who has already learned over time that responding costs more than enduring. It was the posture of someone who had calculated the risks and decided that silence was the safest strategy available. He backed away again, left, went down to the parking lot, and sat in the car for almost half an hour before being able to start the engine. In that closed silence in the building's basement, with the muffled noise of the city outside, Raphael finally stopped trying to construct alternative hypotheses. There was an uncomfortable clarity taking the place of doubt, and he knew from the experience of many years dealing with complex situations that ignoring this clarity would only postpone a reckoning that sooner or later would be inevitable. In the days that followed, he began to observe with an attention that he no longer tried to disguise from himself. He noticed that Isabella never spoke of Donna Conceção by her full name in front of visitors. She called her the cleaning girl, as if the name were a dispensable detail. He noticed that she never asked how she was, never commented on anything personal, never left space for the worker to exist beyond the function she performed. There was a very clear border installed there, and it had been built from only one side. At a Saturday lunch with Isabella's parents, Raphael observed the family dynamic with new eyes. The father, Helio Vasconcelos, was a polite man with good manners toward everyone. But there was a certain automatic distance with the restaurant employees, a way of never fixing his gaze on the waiters when he ordered something, as if the act of ordering were sufficient, and the recognition of the person serving was an unnecessary detail. Isabella's mother, Vera, was more affable, but there was in her also that veiled condescension, the compliment that at the same time distances. "How kind, how careful," said to the sommelier with a smile that didn't completely reach her eyes. Raphael realized, with a feeling that wasn't quite surprise but also wasn't quite comfort, that Isabella had learned all of that at home. It wasn't an aberration in a person's character. It was a cultural heritage transmitted so naturally that probably none of the three had ever stopped to examine it. This didn't make the behavior acceptable, but it made the situation more complex than a simple division between villain and victim, and Raphael knew that complexity demanded more care, not less. It was on a Wednesday afternoon that the definitive episode happened. Raphael arrived at the apartment at the agreed time without surprise and found Isabella and Donna Conceção in the large living room. But this time he was visible. This time Isabella knew he was there. And even so, at no point did she change her tone. She asked the worker to repeat the cleaning of the glass in the office window because there was a reflection in the light that bothered her. Donna Conceção went. She came back. Isabella looked, said it still wasn't good. The worker went again without a word. Raphael observed all that from the sofa, with an open book on his lap of which he didn't read a line. Isabella was beside him, calm, sliding her finger on the cell phone screen with the relaxation of someone who just ordered a pizza and waits for the delivery without major emotions. And it was that specific contrast, that absolute normalcy with which she exercised that small and constant power, that made Raphael understand that there was no more room for doubt. That night after dinner, when Isabella went to take a shower, he opened the computer and for the first time began to mentally list what would be necessary to do. Not with anger, with the same cold precision with which he dismantled a business that had stopped making sense. There were practical things to resolve, an entire structure built over months that would need to be dismantled with care. But before any practical decision, there was a conversation that needed to happen. A conversation that he still didn't know for sure how to start, but that he knew he couldn't postpone for much longer. In the 3 following days, Raphael maintained the routine with a care that cost him more energy than any difficult negotiation of the last few years. He had dinner with Isabella as usual, talked about the last details of the wedding, heard about the bridal bouquet that had arrived different from what she had requested and would need to be redone. He responded to everything with enough presence not to raise suspicions, but there was a new distance installed inside him that he himself felt as a kind of transparent glass between the scene and him, as if he were watching a movie from an adjacent room. One night, while Isabella slept, he tiptoed out to the balcony and stood looking at the lights of Itaim below. There was an entire city functioning at that hour: delivery people, security guards, building cleaners, night workers, each with their name, their story, their bill to pay at the end of the month. He thought of Donna Conceção taking the bus back home 3 times a week after a shift that included not only physical work but also the silent weight of being treated as if her dignity were a privilege to be granted and not a basic human condition. He thought that he had slept under the same roof as all that without seeing, and that idea, more than any other, was the one that stayed. He went back to bed carefully, lay on his back and stared at the ceiling until 3 in the morning. When sleep finally came, it was light and full of images that he couldn't retain upon waking, but the clarity that had arrived on the balcony remained, sharp, firm, without the fog of hesitation that had surrounded his reflections in the previous weeks. Raphael Drummond had built everything he had by learning to recognize the difference between what seemed right and what was right. And now that same skill was being summoned on a terrain he had never foreseen having to navigate. What disturbed him most, as he stood there on the balcony listening to the distant noise of the city, was thinking about how many times he had been in the apartment while that happened and simply hadn't paid attention. He had arrived home with reports full in his head. He had crossed the hallway without hearing what was happening in the service area. He had sat on the sofa beside Isabella without realizing that on the other side of a wall Someone was enduring something they shouldn't have to endure. Unintentional ignorance had a different weight from deliberate cruelty, but it had weight, and Raphael felt that weight with a clarity that had not been present in the previous weeks, when he was still trying to construct alternative hypotheses for what he had seen. There was one person with whom Raphael talked when things became too serious to carry alone. It wasn't a long-time friend or a trusted partner. It was Augusto Mendez, his accountant and business advisor for almost 12 years, a man in his 60s who had accompanied every phase of the construction of the Drummond chain and who had the rare talent of listening more than he spoke. Raphael called him for a coffee outside the office on a Thursday morning in a quiet place in Villa Olympia and went straight to the point without preambles. Augusto listened to everything without interrupting. Raphael told it with the same objectivity he used to describe an operational problem, what he had seen, when he had seen it, how many times it had repeated, what he had noticed afterward. He didn't use loaded words. He didn't dramatize. When he finished, he sat looking at the coffee that had gone cold without him noticing. Augusto was silent for a few seconds. Then he said he understood what Raphael was feeling, and also said that there was an important difference between what a person does and what a person is, and that this difference needed to be considered before any step. He wasn't defending Isabella. He was, as always, asking for precision in the diagnosis before the decision. Raphael nodded, but responded that he had already spent enough time observing to distinguish a habit from an accident, that there were 3 weeks of data, not 1 afternoon of stress, that the problem was not the behavior itself, it was what the behavior revealed about how Isabella saw the world and the people who lived in it. Augusto did not argue. He asked for another coffee and said, with the serenity of someone who has already seen many difficult decisions, that when a man like Raphael reached a conclusion with that tone of voice, generally he already had the answer and was just looking for someone to confirm that he was right in following it. Back at the office, Raphael spent the afternoon meeting with his legal team, under the pretext of reviewing lease contracts for 2 of the hotels. But at the end of the meeting, he was left alone with Dr. Patricia Saraiva, the lawyer who had handled his personal affairs for 6 years, and asked her to quietly look into what had been signed up to that moment in the context of the wedding. Contracts with suppliers, service agreements, any document with financial implications that would need to be revisited if the wedding did not happen. Patricia asked nothing. She made notes, said she would have an overview in 48 hours. That same week, Isabella suggested that the two go together to visit the wedding venue for a lighting test that the wedding planner had scheduled. Raphael went. He spent 2 hours in a hall in Jardins, while technicians adjusted spotlights, and Isabella and the planner discussed the intensity of the light over the bride and groom's table. There was an impressive care in every detail of that production. Rehearsed flowers, calculated angles, every element thought out to compose a perfect image. And Raphael stood looking at all that with a new feeling, that there was something deeply coherent in Isabella's obsession with appearances. She knew exactly how things should look. What happened outside the camera angle was another matter. On the way back, Isabella was excited, talking about the texture of the central arrangement and about a lighting detail that had exceeded expectations. Raphael listened, responded, asked the right questions. But there was a stillness installed beneath all that which he no longer tried to disguise from himself. It was the stillness of a decision made that had not yet been said out loud. 2 days later, the episode happened that Raphael would later describe to himself as the point of no return. He arrived at the apartment at lunchtime to pick up a document he had forgotten. The door was open. Donna Conceição was in the hallway with the cleaning materials, and Isabella, on the phone in the living room, was speaking in a louder voice than usual about an unforeseen event with the invitation printer. Upon seeing Raphael enter, Isabella waved to him with a smile and continued on the call, but then, without hanging up the phone, she covered the device with her hand and said to Donna Conceição, who was 2 meters from her, that she needed her to get out of there because it was hard to concentrate with noise. The worker was just wiping a cloth on the baseboard, in absolute silence. There was no noise at all. Donna Conceição picked up the bucket and walked to the hallway without a word. Raphael stood looking at the scene. Isabella went back to the phone with the same voice as before, carefree, efficient, And at that moment, the distance between the two versions of Isabella, the one he knew and the one he had spent weeks discovering, collapsed for good. There was no longer any way to separate the two. They were the same person. He took the document, gave a quick kiss on the forehead of Isabella, who was still on the phone, and left. In the elevator, he stood looking at his own reflection in the mirror and thought that there was something very strange about recognizing someone completely, only to realize that he had never really known them. That afternoon, Raphael returned to the office and sat on his highest floor, the 12th, looking at the city that spread out below the panoramic window. He had built that view with his own hands, in the most literal sense possible. Every brick paid for with real work, every floor conquered with a decision that cost something. And he had arrived there carrying a simple compass, which concerned the way he wanted to be, and the way he wanted to treat the people around him, regardless of any hierarchy that the world insisted on imposing. That compass had never pointed to the wrong place, and now it was pointing with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. He called Patricia Saraiva and asked her to speed up the assessment. He said he would need the full overview by the end of the week. The lawyer responded that it would be ready on Friday morning. Raphael thanked her, hung up, and stood looking at the city for a few more minutes before returning to the meetings that still filled the second half of that afternoon. He had made difficult decisions before. He knew what it was like. He also knew that this one would be different from all the others, not because of the complexity of the numbers, but because of the weight of what was being left behind. At 7 in the evening, when the office had emptied and only the city light entered through the window, Raphael stayed there a while longer, letting the silence do the work that words still couldn't. There was a difference, he had learned over the years, between the sadness that came from losing something that existed and the sadness that came from discovering that what seemed to exist had never been completely real. Both hurt, but the second had a different texture, deeper, because it didn't even leave the memory intact. And it was with this specific texture that he was learning to live, in that room, in that city, in that moment that no one else would know had existed. He left the office at 8:30, went down to the garage and sat in the car for a few minutes before starting the engine. He thought of Isabella waiting at home, probably with the television on the decoration channel she liked, with a simple dinner she sometimes made when he arrived late. He thought that there was a version of Isabella that he had genuinely loved, and that this version had not disappeared. It had only revealed that it coexisted with another that he could not accept. Starting the engine was, that night, the heaviest gesture of the entire week. Friday arrived with the cold clarity of July mornings in São Paulo, that cloudless sky that looks beautiful but does not warm. Raphael was in the office at 8 when Patricia Saraiva arrived with a thin folder and a tablet. They sat in the smaller meeting room away from the team, and she presented the overview with her usual professional objectivity. There were contracts with 8 suppliers, 2 of them with a cancellation clause without a penalty, up to 45 days before the event, the others with staggered penalties. There was a prenuptial agreement still in the revision phase, therefore not signed. There was the hall reservation partially paid with the possibility of a partial refund upon formal request, at least 30 days in advance. Raphael listened to everything with attention and asked specific questions. At the end, Patricia closed the folder and said, with the care of someone choosing words on delicate ground, that from a legal and financial point of view, the sooner the decision was made, the smaller the impact would be. Raphael responded that he understood, and that he needed her to start the process of contacting the suppliers discreetly, as a schedule review, without mentioning cancellation yet. She said she would do it. She stood up. At the door, she turned and said only that she hoped he was well. He thanked her with an expression that was too honest to pretend he was. That weekend was the longest Raphael remembered in years. Isabella had planned a lunch with a couple of friends on Saturday, people he had known for a short time, who were part of her social life in a way he had never completely integrated into. Lunch was at a restaurant in Pinheiros, a place with an internal garden and a fusion menu that was in fashion. Raphael went. He behaved normally, participated in conversations about travel, about the new architecture office one of the friends had opened, about the approaching wedding. Isabella was radiant at that lunch. There was something in her that Raphael observed with a new sadness. She was genuinely happy at that moment, in that context, surrounded by those people. The version of her that appeared in situations like that was real. She was effective, intelligent, animated. And Raphael thought, while he heard her tell a funny story about the dress's seamstress, that perhaps this was the most painful part of everything. There wasn't a villain of a simple narrative. There was a person who had been formed in a specific way, who carried beautiful things and terrible things with the same naturalness, and who probably had never been confronted with either of them. On Sunday, the two stayed home. Isabella organized wedding papers on the living room table, while Raphael tried to read. Donna Conceção did not work on Sundays, so the apartment had a different stillness, less charged. At some point in the afternoon, Isabella went to where he was sitting and rested her chin on his shoulder, looking at the book he was holding without reading. She asked what he was thinking about. He said about nothing specific. She stayed there for a few seconds, then went to get water, and Raphael sat looking at the page he hadn't read and thinking that there was a deadline running out that neither of them had named yet. On Monday, Raphael made an intermediate decision before the definitive conversation. He arrived at the apartment at a time when he knew Isabella would not be there, only Donna Conceção doing the weekly cleaning. He knocked on the door as if he were a visitor, and the worker opened with that usual reserved expression, the look of someone who is used to calibrating reactions before anything else. Raphael asked permission to enter and asked if he could talk to her for a few minutes. Donna Conceção nodded, clearly surprised. They sat in the kitchen, one on each side of the counter, and Raphael asked, in a direct but gentle way, how things were for her in the apartment. If she was comfortable, if there was anything that bothered her. There was a silence. Donna Conceção looked at her own hands for a moment. Then she said that everything was fine, with a voice that had the same weight as always, the weight of someone who learned that this is the correct answer. Raphael said he understood that it was a difficult question, and that she didn't need to answer in any specific way. But that he had noticed some things and wanted her to know that, regardless of what happened, she would be treated with respect, and her working conditions would be revised for the better, no matter what the future brought. Donna Conceção looked up. There was something there. It wasn't exactly surprise, it was more like the expression of someone who hears a sentence they had given up waiting for. She said nothing for a few seconds. Then she said, "Thank you," with a voice that had a different texture from the other times she had spoken that word in that apartment. Raphael kept that "thank you" inside his chest for several days, because there was in it an exact measure of how necessary it had been for someone to say something so simple. He left before Isabella arrived, as he had planned. He went back to the office and stayed late, rereading the reports he had ignored during that entire week of observation and wait. There was a new hotel being evaluated in Campinas, a partnership proposal that needed a response by the end of the month. Concrete things with verifiable numbers and measurable results. Raphael dove into them for a few hours with the relief of someone who finds solid ground after a long time on the open sea. But when he turned off the computer and the silence of the empty office took over, what remained was that "thank you" from Donna Conceção, and the certainty that in the following week he would need to have the conversation he had postponed for too long. On Tuesday, Raphael did something he had postponed since the beginning of everything. He called Maria Luisa, his mother, who lived in an apartment in Tatuapé that he had bought for her 5 years ago. He didn't call to tell her what was happening. He called just to hear her voice. Maria Luisa spoke about the cake she had made for the neighbor, about the pain in her ankle that had been improving with physical therapy, about a series she had started watching and was enjoying. Raphael listened to everything with an attention that went beyond words, because his mother's voice had for him the function of calibrating what was essential and what was noise. When he hung up, he sat looking at the phone for a moment and thought that there was one thing Maria Luisa had never done in her whole life: treat someone as if they were less because they occupied a different position, and that this, more than any material achievement he had accumulated, was the heritage he in fact carried. The next day he woke up with a calm that had not been present in the previous weeks. It was the calm of someone who has finished deciding. There was nothing more to observe, nothing to verify, no residual doubt waiting for one more episode to resolve itself. There was only a conversation to have, and a path to travel after it, and Raphael knew he was ready for both. On that Thursday morning, he sent a brief audio to Isabella, saying that they needed to talk at the end of the day, that it was important, and that he preferred it to be at home. Isabella responded with a question mark, and then with an, "Okay, I'll wait for you." Raphael put away his phone, opened the reports for the Campinas hotel, and spent the entire morning on them with a concentration he hadn't managed in weeks. There was something liberating about knowing that the moment had arrived, that there was no longer the weight of waiting, only the weight of what needed to be said, which was a completely different and much more manageable weight. Raphael arrived at the apartment at 7 in the evening. Isabella had prepared a simple dinner, pasta with fresh tomato sauce, and the table was set with that attention to detail she had for everything. There was a candle in the center, the small kind she used on ordinary days without a specific occasion. Seeing that was one of the most difficult moments of the afternoon, because it revealed that she didn't know what was coming, and there was something very heavy about being the only person in the room carrying that information. He arrived, greeted her with a hug she didn't realize was different from the others, sat down, ate a little. Isabella spoke about the day, about a meeting with the wedding planner that had gone well, about a bureaucratic issue with the notary's office that had been resolved. Raphael listened, responded when necessary. When dinner finished and the two were left with coffee at the table, he said her name in a way she immediately recognized as different. Isabella looked up. Raphael was not long. He said he had spent the last few weeks observing something that had profoundly disturbed him, and that he needed to be honest with her before anything else. He spoke about what he had seen and heard in the service area, about the repetitions he had witnessed afterward, about the pattern he had identified over the days. He used precise words, without cruelty, but also without softening, that would distort what needed to be said. He said he had noticed the way she treated Donna Conceição, the way she treated waiters and doormen, and that he had recognized in that pattern something he couldn't ignore. Isabella listened in silence for a while. Then she said she thought he was exaggerating, that there was a natural level of demand in a well-organized domestic environment, that there was nothing wrong with establishing clear standards with those hired for a service. She said the sentence with a moderate tone, like someone explaining something obvious to a person who has momentarily lost perspective, and there was in that tone a confirmation so precise of what Raphael had observed for weeks that he was quiet for an instant, simply recognizing it. Then he said he understood her point of view, and he said that the problem was not the disagreement over the level of domestic demand. It was that, for her, the sentence was about standards and efficiency. For him, the same scene was about the dignity of a person who had no other option but to endure. He said he had grown up beside a woman who worked her whole life in situations like that, and that he couldn't build a future beside someone who looked at those situations without seeing what he saw. Isabella was quiet. There was something different in her expression now. It was no longer the security of someone who explains. It was something closer to someone who begins to understand that the ground is moving. She asked if he was saying what she thought he was saying. Raphael said yes. He said he was not ending the engagement because of one scene. He was ending it because those scenes revealed to him a fundamental incompatibility about how each of them saw the people around them. And this incompatibility was not something that a conversation or an effort at understanding could resolve, because it wasn't a communication problem, it was a difference of values. The silence that followed was long. Isabella sat looking at the table. When she turned her eyes back to him, there was something there that Raphael didn't completely expect. It wasn't immediate anger, it was genuine confusion. As if she were trying to process a logic that didn't fit into the structure she had built to understand the world. She asked, with a lower voice than usual, if he really was ending the engagement because of how she treated the cleaning worker. Raphael responded that he was ending it because he had discovered through that who she was when she judged there were no consequences, and that he couldn't pretend he hadn't seen. Isabella stood up. She stood for a moment with her arms crossed, looking out the window. Then she said that he was being unfair, that she had given everything to that relationship, that no marriage was perfect, and that ending everything because of a detail like that was a cruelty on his part. Raphael listened to everything without interrupting. When she finished, he said he heard what she was feeling, and that he understood that it seemed unfair. But that what she called a detail was, for him, something central, and that this difference in perspective confirmed, more than anything else, that the decision was correct. He got up from the table, went to the bedroom to get some things he would need for the following days, and returned to the living room with a bag. Isabella was still standing near the window, with that expression of someone who is calculating the impact of something they haven't yet completely accepted. Raphael said that Patricia would be in touch about the practical matters, that everything would be treated with respect and transparency, and that he genuinely hoped she would be well. There was no resentment in what he said. There was something closer to sadness, the kind that doesn't need a guilty party to exist. He left the apartment for the last time as a resident at 8:40 in the evening. The elevator descended in silence. The building hall was empty. Outside, Rua Leopoldo Couto de Magalhães had the usual movement of a Thursday any time: cars, pedestrians, the smell of food coming from a restaurant on the corner. Raphael stopped for a moment on the sidewalk, breathed the night air and began to walk without a specific destination, knowing he had done the right thing, and that this, in itself, didn't make the night any less heavy. That night, he stayed in one of his own hotels, the Drummondy Time, a place where he knew every detail but in which he rarely stayed as a guest. The receptionist on duty, a young woman named Deborah, who had worked there for 2 years, did the check-in with the usual professional discretion and asked no questions. Raphael went up to the room, stood before the window for a while looking at the city lights, and then sat on the edge of the bed and stayed there doing nothing for almost half an hour. There was a strange lightness mixed with the fatigue, the lightness of someone who stopped carrying something that had been weighing for weeks without the load being completely visible until the moment it was finally deposited. Raphael recognized that feeling from other difficult decisions in the past. It was the sign that he had done what needed to be done. It wasn't joy, it was integrity. And integrity, he had learned over the years, had a very specific texture. It didn't celebrate, it didn't relieve immediately, but it stayed. It stayed when everything else passed. He ordered a vegetable broth from room service, ate slowly watching the news without paying attention, and at 11 at night turned off the light. He slept deeper than he had slept in weeks, without images, without the weight of waiting that had marked the previous nights. Outside, São Paulo continued being São Paulo, noisy and different, generous in its crooked way. And Raphael Drummond, son of a washerwoman, owner of 4 hotels and a man who had learned to recognize patterns where it mattered, let the city do its work of continuing to exist, while he, for the first time in a long time, simply rested. The days that followed were busy, and Raphael was grateful for that. There was an immense amount of work to do, suppliers to contact, appointments to cancel, an apartment to be logistically reorganized, the news to be communicated to people who had been invited to a wedding that would no longer happen. Patricia Saraiva handled most of it with an efficiency that Raphael deeply appreciated, without drama, without judgment, just the methodical resolution of each point on the list. The most difficult was none of those tasks. It was the call to Isabella's family. Raphael called Helio Vasconcelos personally on a Friday morning, not because he was forced to, but because he understood that it was what a man of his word did. Isabella's father listened in silence. He said at the end that he lamented it. Raphael said he did too. There were no accusations from either side. The call lasted less than 10 minutes and left Raphael with a specific sadness, the sadness of breaking something that involved more than 2 people, that had created bonds and expectations in a structure larger than the 2 fiancés. The news spread with the speed that these things have in social circles, where lives are partially public. Common friends called Isabella, called Raphael, tried to understand what had happened. Raphael didn't give detailed explanations to anyone. He said only that it had been a mutual decision, that both parties were well, and ended the subject with the firmness of someone who is not interested in building narratives for external consumption. Isabella, on the other hand, did not stay silent. Through common friends, Raphael learned that she was describing the situation as irrational behavior on his part, a hasty decision based on a mistaken interpretation of something trivial. There was in the versions that reached him a clear consistency. She positioned herself as a victim of an impossible demand, as someone who had been abandoned for a reason that made no sense. Raphael heard these versions with distance. He felt no need to rebut them. There was something very revealing in the choice of terms she used, the same inability to see what had happened that had motivated the entire decision. Isabella's social circle was broad and well articulated, and Raphael knew his image would be affected for a time. Some events to which he would normally be invited would start happening without him. Some names that previously greeted him with warmth would become colder. He accepted all that with a serenity that surprised even himself. He had built what he had without depending on that circle, and what he had built would not be affected by any narrative circulating in Jardin's dinners. The issue of Donna Conceição, however, stayed with him in a different way from the others. It was the part he felt was unfinished. In the week following the end of the engagement, Raphael contacted the worker through the number he had found in the apartment records and asked for a meeting. She accepted with that usual caution, and they met at a simple cafe near the neighborhood where she lived, in Ipiranga, on a Saturday morning. Raphael was direct. He said he wanted to apologize, that he had lived in the same apartment for 2 years without noticing what was happening, and that this ignorance, even if it wasn't intentional, had a weight for which he needed to take responsibility. Donna Conceição sat listening to him with that reserved expression he had learned to read during the weeks of observation. There was dignity in that reserve. It wasn't coldness. It was the posture of someone who had learned that excess emotion in an unbalanced professional environment has a cost. He also said there was a concrete proposal. There was an expansion project for the Drummond hotels that included the opening of a new unit in Santo André in the ABC Paulista region, with operations scheduled for the following year. The hotel's housekeeping team was being formed. There was a vacancy for a cleaning supervisor for someone who had real experience and solid references. Raphael said Donna Conceição had both things, and that if she were interested, he would like her to consider it. Donna Conceição sat looking at her coffee cup for a moment. Then she looked up and said she had never received a proposal like that. Raphael said that this was a problem he hoped to help correct, at least in part. She asked for a few days to think. He said there was all the time in the world, and that the proposal was genuine regardless of the decision. They left the cafe and went in opposite directions on the Ipiranga sidewalk, each back to their day. Raphael walked to the car, feeling that he had closed something that needed to be closed, not with a grand gesture, but with the same objectivity with which he had approached everything else. He had fixed what was possible to fix. What wasn't possible to fix had stayed where it needed to stay. At the end of that afternoon, sitting on the balcony of the new apartment he had rented provisionally in Pinheiros while deciding the next steps, Raphael sat looking at the city's irregular horizon. There was a thin breeze that sometimes appeared in the São Paulo winter, and that turned the afternoon light a particular orange. He sat looking at that light for a while, without a cell phone, without reports, without anything that asked for an immediate response. There was a different stillness in that moment. It wasn't the silence of accumulated weight, it was the silence of an open space, the kind that appears when something old ends and it is not yet known what will come next. 3 days later, Donna Conceição called. She said she had thought carefully and that she would like to accept the proposal. Her voice had a different modulation from what Raphael had heard in the Itaim apartment, more direct, firmer, as if the call were being made from a place where she had more space to be herself. Raphael thanked her and said he would put her in touch with the human resources team of the hotels later that week. Before hanging up, she said one thing that stayed with him. She said that for years she had worked in houses where she was invisible, and that she was not used to being treated as a person with a future. Raphael was quiet for a second. Then he said he lamented that this had been the pattern, and that he hoped from then on things would be different. He hung up the phone and sat looking at the screen for some time. There was a very specific satisfaction in that moment, different from the satisfaction of closing a deal or surpassing a financial goal. It was more like the feeling of being aligned with himself, of having acted coherently with what he believed, even when it had cost something real. Raphael Drummond was not a man of speeches about values. He was a man who had learned in the most concrete way possible that character is not what you profess, but what you do when you think no one important is looking, and that this applied as much to him as to any other person. That night, he called Maria Luisa and told her everything. His mother listened with the characteristic silence of someone who processes before speaking. At the end, She said only that her son had been raised to recognize good people, and that sometimes recognizing good people also meant recognizing when someone was not. Raphael said he had learned that from her. Maria Luisa said she hadn't taught anything, just lived the way she thought was right. And that was it. That it was enough. Raphael agreed, and for the first time in many weeks he smiled in a way that reached his eyes. 2 months after the end of the engagement, one thing happened that Raphael had not foreseen. The story leaked. Not in the dramatic way stories leak in soap operas, with revealed documents or betrayals exposed publicly. It leaked the way real things leak, little by little, in pieces, through people who knew someone who knew someone. And the version circulating over time was getting closer to the truth than Raphael had expected. There was a friend of Isabella, Claudia, who had worked years ago as a volunteer in an NGO defending labor rights, and who, upon hearing the story for the 3rd time from different sources, asked to talk to Raphael. He accepted, not knowing for sure what to expect. They met at a cafe in Moema on a September afternoon, with that anticipated heat that sometimes arrived before the end of the São Paulo winter. Claudia was direct. She said she had lived with Isabella for years, and that in retrospect she recognized the pattern Raphael described, because there were similar scenes she had witnessed and ignored, explaining them to herself as perfectionism or anxiety. She said there was something very specific in the type of cruelty that disguises itself as demand, which is exactly its invisible character that makes it so hard to name and to face. She said that what Raphael had done by ending the engagement and by offering a concrete opportunity to Dona Conceição was a rare thing, not because it was heroic, but because it demanded honesty with himself at a moment when it was much easier to close his eyes. Raphael listened with attention. He said he hadn't done anything extraordinary. He had only done what was necessary. Claudia responded that this was exactly the difference between the people who do what is right and those who only talk about doing it. He left that cafe with something that had been missing in the previous weeks, the feeling of being understood without needing to explain himself completely. There was something valuable in that kind of encounter, the right person at the right time, saying the right thing without dramatizing. Raphael kept that afternoon with care. In that same month, the Santo André Hotel entered the final phase of preparation for opening. Raphael visited the facilities on a Tuesday with the entire management team, and it was on that visit that he saw Dona Conceição for the first time in her new context. She was training 2 young women recently hired for the cleaning team, showing the correct technique for the finishing of the rooms with a calm and a clarity that were completely different from the posture Raphael had seen in the Itaim apartment. There was something in the way she moved in that space that was the difference between a person occupying the place that belonged to her and a person enduring the place to which she had been confined. Raphael stood observing from afar for a few minutes before approaching. When she saw him, she nodded her head with a contained but genuine smile. He asked how it was going. She said it was being good, said she had slept better in the last few weeks. Raphael said he was happy to hear that. And there was in that short stretch of conversation more substance than in many of the long dinners he had had during the months of the engagement. The hotel opening happened on a Friday in October, with a simple ceremony for guests and partners. Raphael made a brief speech, thanked the team, mentioned that each hotel in the Drummond chain had been built on the principle that those who work in a place deserve to be treated with the same dignity as the guest who pays to be there. There was polite applause, but what stayed with him afterward was not the applause. It was what Augusto Mendes said at his side quietly, while people talked around them, that it was good to see that Raphael had come out of the difficult period being the same person he had entered as. Raphael said he hoped so. Augusto said he knew so. Isabella, Raphael learned through third parties, had spent the first months trying to regain the social space the breakup had shaken. The public image of a relationship broken for an unclear reason had a cost, especially in a circle where appearances were currency. Over time, the narrative she had constructed of herself as a victim was losing strength, not because someone directly refuted it, but because reality has a way of imposing itself through the small inconsistencies that accumulate. Raphael did not follow this closely. It wasn't resentment nor performative disinterest. It was simply that her path had followed another way, and his was completely occupied with things that mattered. There was a new partnership proposal with a Portuguese hotel chain that he was evaluating. There was the Campinas Hotel advancing faster than expected. There was Maria Luisa with her ankle finally healed and a trip scheduled for the coast that the two had planned for months, and that, this time, Raphael had promised himself would not be cancelled by any meeting. There was also Claudia, with whom he had met twice more since the Moema Café. There was no label for what that was yet, and Raphael felt no rush to find one. There was only the realization that it was much easier to be with a person who saw the world the same way he did, a person for whom the dignity of others was not an abstraction or a commitment of speech, but a daily practice that manifested in the simplest and most revealing gestures. On a November afternoon, Raphael stopped again at the flower shop on Rua Leopoldo Couto de Magalhães. It wasn't on purpose. He passed by there on the way to a meeting and recognized the place with that familiarity that locations carry when they are linked to landmark moments. He entered, bought a small bouquet, yellow roses this time, because there was someone who was going through a difficult period, and for whom that could be a good thing. He left with the flowers and went walking along the sidewalk with that lightness of someone who no longer carries the weight of what was not theirs to carry. What had happened in those months was not a simple story of hero and villain. Raphael knew that better than anyone. It was the story of a man who had arrived home to make a surprise and had found, in place of what he expected, something that demanded more courage than any negotiation he had ever faced. The courage to see clearly, to act according to what he saw, and to accept the cost of it without transforming it into resentment. There was something he had learned in that process that didn't fit in any management manual, nor in any lecture on leadership. It was the idea that character is not revealed on big occasions, but in the moments when the person believes there is no witness. That the way someone treats those who cannot react says more about who that person is than any public declaration or calculated gesture intended to be seen. And that when you discover this about someone, it is not possible to undo the discovery. It is only possible to decide what to do with it. Raphael had decided, and he was at peace with the decision in a way that didn't need external approval to exist. He had done what he had done not to be admired, not to tell anyone, but because it had been the only thing that made sense when measured by the compass he had carried since Tatuapé. And that compass, with all its years of use, had never pointed to the wrong place. 6 months after the afternoon in which Raphael Drummond had entered an apartment with a bouquet of white roses and left without saying a word, the Drummond Santo André Hotel opened its doors to the public with all accommodations occupied on the first weekend. It was a Friday in April, with that thin and persistent rain that São Paulo usually reserves for the transitions of seasons, as if the city also needed an interval between one phase and another. Raphael was present at the hotel reception when the first guests arrived. He didn't stay in the center of the hall. He stayed a bit to the side, observing with that posture of someone who prefers to see things happen than to be seen in the middle of them. There was a particular satisfaction in having built a place that worked, not only as a business, but as an environment where every person involved, from the receptionist to the person responsible for maintenance, had been hired with criteria that went beyond technical competence. Donna Conceição was in the housekeeping area when he passed by there late in the afternoon. She coordinated the checking of the last rooms before the opening dinner, with a list in hand, and 2 people around her who listened to her with attention. Raphael stopped at the door for a moment without being noticed. There was something in that scene that he needed a few seconds to identify with precision. It was the image of a person in their place of full right, not tolerated, not supported, not managed with condescension, but present and recognized for what she in fact had to offer. When she saw him, she smiled in a way that was different from all the smiles Raphael had seen from her in the 2 years of the apartment. It was the smile of someone who has ground under their feet. He nodded his head and continued walking, because that moment didn't need more than that. The opening dinner gathered partners, investors, and team members in a hall decorated with functional simplicity that was the aesthetic mark of the Drummond hotels. Nothing unnecessary, everything thought out for those who were going to use it. Augusto Mendes arrived with his usual punctuality and stayed by Raphael's side for a good part of the night, commenting with discreet pleasure on the numbers that the new hotel promised for the coming quarters. Claudia arrived later, with her coat still wet from the rain outside, and when Raphael saw her crossing the hall toward him, he realized there was something very simple and very right in that gesture of crossing a space towards someone. There was no drama in that. There was not the weight of expectations built over 3 years, nor the cost of a carefully maintained image. There were only two people who saw the world in a similar way, and who were discovering, with the calm of those who are in no rush to label things, that this was a much more solid base than any well-rehearsed script. During the dinner, Raphael looked around at the people around the table. Augusto with his dry humor and his silent loyalty, Claudia with her precise points of view and her willingness to say what she thought even when it was inconvenient, the team members who had built that hotel together with him. He thought of Maria Luisa, who at that moment was at the coast with a neighbor, finally enjoying the trip that had been postponed so many times. He thought that there was something in the composition of that table that was the direct result of having made difficult choices with honesty. Isabella was not there. She was not in any part of his life at that moment, and there was in that a neutrality that Raphael had reached over time. It wasn't coldness nor resentment. It was simply the realization that some stories end and leave space for others to begin. There was a version of Isabella that he had loved genuinely. There was a version of her that could not be the person she said she was when no one she considered important was looking. These two versions coexisted in the same person, and Raphael had learned that it was not possible to have one without the other. The rain continued outside when the dinner finished, and people began to leave. Raphael stayed a little longer, helping the team organize the hall with the informality of someone who doesn't separate the owner from the work. When the last glass was washed and the lights were being turned off one by one, he stayed for an instant in the empty hall, with the rain beating on the windows and that specific quietude of places that just received a lot of life and now rest. He had arrived there carrying a simple compass, inherited not from any business school nor from any famous mentor, but from a woman who had ironed clothes her whole life and who had taught her son, without a speech, just by example, that the way you treat the people who cannot harm you says everything that needs to be said about who you are. Raphael Drummond had learned this lesson too late to avoid some stumbles, but he had learned it at the right time to build from it something that lasted. He left through the side door, raised the collar of his coat against the rain and walked toward the car with the same calm of someone who knows where they are going. São Paulo shone wet around him, noisy and indifferent as always, generous in its particular way, and Raphael Drummond, son of Tatuapé, owner of 5 hotels now, continued walking with the lightness of someone who is at peace with what he built and with what he chose to leave behind. If you reach the end of this story, it is because you know what it means to recognize in a narrative something that resonates with truth. The stories of Raphael and Conceição exist in every city, in every apartment hallway, in every gesture that goes unnoticed, because those who could notice chose not to look. Here on the channel we believe that these stories deserve to be told, not to judge, but so that each of us can ask ourselves who we are when no one important is looking. If this story touched you, leave your like because it says that you also believe this matters. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories, and tell us in the comments. Have you ever had a moment like Raphael's in which you noticed something about someone that was not possible to unsee? We read everything. Until the next story. End of the story. And if you want to continue in this universe of stories that explore what is most human in people, we have a special list waiting for you here on the channel, stories of silent courage, of dignity that resists, of people who made the right choice when it was easier not to. Click over there on the side and let the next story begin. We'll see you there. Because in the end, what Raphael discovered on that Thursday afternoon with a bouquet in his hands was not just the truth about another person. It was a truth about himself, about the kind of man he wanted to be, about the choices he had made and those he would still need to make, about the fact that building something with integrity is not an isolated event, but a continuous practice, renewed every time the world offers the attempt to look the other way. And he had looked, he had seen, he had acted, and it was that, after all, what made his story worthy of being told.